Hello and welcome to this AIM North America webinar on CTE events. Where does the data go? I'm Mike Elm, the Business Development Director for AIM. Before we get things started, I do have a few housekeeping notes to go over. First, it's the policy of AIM North America to conduct its operations in strict compliance with the antitrust laws. No AIM North America activities shall create even the appearance of a violation of the letter or spirit of the antitrust laws. Next is the GS1 US legal disclosure. Please review this now. And then next is the AIM North America collaboration and work product policy. Today's webinar is held for the primary purpose of advancements in our industry, which necessarily involves development of work product intended solely for the public domain. AIM North America has developed this policy for the protection of its members who engage in this important collaborative effort. And some additional housekeeping notes. All participants are muted, but if you would like to ask the panel a question, you can send those via the Q&A option at the bottom of the application screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the webinar. Also, for those who have registered for the webinar, there will be a recording available on YouTube, but you will be notified when that recording is available. So our speakers today are John DiPalo, Chief Strategy Officer for ACSIS, Julie McGill, Vice President of Supply Chain and Insights at Trustwell, and Lucy Angarita, Director of Community Engagement for GS1 US. Welcome, panelists. And Julie will be kicking things off with the agenda for the webinar. So welcome, Julie.
All right, thanks so much. All right, so for the group today, we are going to do a real quick overview of FSMA 204. Certainly, there might be some of you on the call who are not familiar with the rules, so we'll do a high-level overview, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lucy, who will speak to those key data elements and critical tracking events so that everyone understands the data that we're speaking to. And then John is going to lead us in a robust Q&A where we'll talk about where the data goes once you're collecting that information. So real quick, I'd like to provide a FSMA 204 overview. And the food traceability rule, which is FSMA 204, this requires that companies that hold foods, so you might be a processor, you might be a shipper or a receiver, you might be doing transformation events, but across the supply chain, these are folks that handle foods that are on the FDA's defined food traceability list. And so there is additional record keeping that is required for those items. So if you manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods that are on that food traceability list, then you need to do this additional traceability record keeping at the lot level. This does cover the entire food supply chain. It includes both foreign and domestic entities. And there are some exemptions, and we encourage you to go look at the FDA's website to determine if you have a full or a partial exemption. So finally, there are some key concepts that I'd like to cover. So the rule really sets a framework for critical tracking events and key data elements. And these are activities that happen in our supply chain and the attributes or the data that needs to come along to define those activities. It does provide a standard language. So we've got defined attributes from the FDA that we need to all share and capture for this record keeping. I mentioned lot codes. There is this idea, and the lot code is absolutely key. They call it a traceability lot code, and those will help link information across our supply chains. This can be done using electronic and/or paper records. Companies will need to lay out a traceability plan and define how they are collecting and storing this information. Finally, the FDA is requesting, if they do request data from you, that they need that data within 24 hours. And it needs to be an assortable spreadsheet. And that last piece, really the whole vision of this is that will allow for faster product identification and removal from items, affected items in our supply chains. This really has an emphasis on data capture, so keeping and then sharing these key data elements, the traceability lot code, as I mentioned, and that lot code source. So what was the company, what was the entity that assigned those lot codes? I mentioned the traceability plan that you must have in place. And then finally, this work can't be done alone. The FDA strongly encourages that companies collaborate and work with their supply chain partners to put their programs and plans in place and implement those traceability plans. So FSMA 204 data capture and sharing. This example is from the FDA. It's a supply chain example, and big picture data must be captured and maintained. And for all shipping events, anytime you see that little orange bubble there, needs to be shared across our supply chains. And as I mentioned, that data would be shared within 24 hours. And then finally, the big piece is, when do you have to comply? We have a 3-year runway for this work. This applies to all firms. They expect everyone to come to be compliant at the same time. And so that date is January 20, 2026, and that is for all companies. So with that, I will hand it over to Lucy to speak to critical tracking events and key data elements.
Thank you so much, Julie. Can everybody hear me okay? I've been having
Yep, I can hear
very
you.
interesting moments with my headset, which I love. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And just like Julie was talking to us about the FDA's direction, I'll detail a little bit more what those bubbles with the CTEs and KDEs mean. Now, many of you who use GS1 standards are familiar and recognize these definitions because we have been using them for many years. CTEs, critical tracking events, they're activities that happen in the supply chain and that should be recorded by capturing key information about the business step, or what if the product is moving, if the product is getting transformed, etc. Now, the KDEs, the key data elements, are the actual attributes that describe that specific event. So, for example, this answers the what, the where, the when, the who, and the why of each of the events. And this framework, as the FDA has shown it and shared it with all companies, forms the foundation, right, for being able to efficiently and effectively share data and communicate it, capture it and communicate it. So when FDA needs it, they can call upon anybody, any company that needs to provide it, and it's going to be in a uniform way. This also, depending on the supply chain stakeholder, right, or the type of supply chain activities that happen, vary. So, for example, from harvesting all the way to production of the food, then through the processing of the food, the distribution, receipt at retail or other points of service is another event that we describe here. So the next slide shows us what the CTEs that the FDA has outlined for us. And a lot of us have been doing this for years, right? It's our day-to-day business, the harvesting, the cooling. We're familiar with some of these. Then there's other new ones that are specific, for example, for produce. If you think about, some products are cooled and then they're initially packed. For seafood specifically, we have the event that describes what happens from the boat to the first land receiver. That is something that is new to some of us, a new concept. Now, the FDA does have a really great tool. We put a picture of it there that you can access in the FDA website, and it describes every single critical tracking event with each of the key data elements that they are requiring. Now, it does happen when we look at all this data that needs to be captured for each and every single of these events, we quickly get overwhelmed. It's a lot of data, but if we organize it into 3 buckets, and actually we would say 2 bigger buckets, master data and transactional data, things start getting a little bit clearer because we have product information, which is most of the time static. We have location information. And then we have that event data, which describes more, what the activity is. So what GS1 standards is actually doing is helping everybody define these attributes in a way that is common, in a common language, so then every supply chain partner can communicate without having to go back and translate what it means. Oh, this is in your system, this term. What is it in my system? Does anybody deal with that? Not really, right? Not us. So that is pretty much the ultimate outcome, right? And the great news is when people see these 3 buckets, they're like, oh, we've been using this before. I have it in my system. A lot of it, not all of it, right? But that is the critical task. It's understanding, what do you have today? What are you sharing today? And what do you need to do? Where is that gap where the FDA is requiring this specific thing in FSMA 204 that I need to implement, that I need to start collecting? Who needs to collect it, etc. So for this, actually, just to identify this gap, we have been working with our members. So it's industry members from the whole supply chain, manufacturers, retailers, operators, distributors, solution providers, association. All of us have come together for over a year, providing insight to create this guideline that is actually showing best practice, right? And the way to, with a common language, working together, meet these FSMA 204 requirements. As we think about it, even since 2006, when the big spinach recalls happened, and I started trying out kale. It's pretty good now. I like it. But since then, and even with the PTI 2008, people were trying to figure out how can we do traceability in a way that's effective, that's efficient, that's accurate. So this guideline is actually showing, that even though you need to worry about the data you ship out, the data you receive, but you have to work together, right? You have to have your supply chain partners in mind, because their decisions and what they do are going to affect you. And if we all have a foundation of standards, right, and not just a proprietary solution here I built there, and all these attributes that I am defining like this, then we all can benefit, right, for being more scalable, more efficient, and ultimately interoperable, which is what we need to be for this effort. Now, I do want to very clearly say the FDA is not prescribing any particular way that companies need to comply. So they're not saying use this, use that. They're just saying this is what you need to achieve. However, throughout the regulation and the comments that we see, they do mention a lot of industry work like GS1, like PTI, like GDST, ISO. So all of these organizations have worked together for years, as I mentioned, to create guidelines, to make sure that, we could use that work that has been done in the past. And the FDA does recognize that industry has created solutions that can help. So we actually included links in the guideline that talk about those comments where they're saying, okay, yes, standards can be used for this, GTINs can be used for that, etc. And that could be very helpful as well as we try to follow these gaps. Now, what is the foundation of GS1 standards? Is identify, capture, and share. Right? And we've covered this in previous AIM webinars, so you can go into their website and take a look at it. I'm not going to dig deep into this, but as we see at the top, as the product moves along the supply chain, the products can be identified with a global trade item number. Locations and parties can be identified with global location numbers. And then also the pallets, as many cases become a pallet, they can be identified, or any logistic unit, with a serial shipping container code. So then these numbers can be put into data carriers and coded in data carriers to travel with the product. For example, if we use GS1 128 barcodes, we can include that GTIN, we can include a date, a lot, all of these to help our supply chain have that visibility, right? There's also GS1 data matrix, which is a 2-dimensional code. There's RFID tags that people are exploring today to include specific information about the product. And then, as the product moves, that data moves with the product. Also, master data. It can be shared in a standardized way. Again, talking about, we have specific names for these specific attributes and these specific definitions. We don't have to interpret it. So that's GDSN. Same thing with the data hub for location or for parties. There's a place where people can store this information and share it with each other. Now, transactional and event data can be shared also using a standard and common language, EDI, that has been used for many, many years. And EPCIS, which is a language to see the product movement or product transformation as it happens along the supply chain. Now, real quick, I just wanted to show what one of our examples, we worked on this for a while with our members and our work group. And it's just an example of the tomato. supply chain. Now, there could be a lot of scenarios, a lot of variations to this. We're not saying this is what always happens, right? But we wanted to identify an example with every element that could have some kind of touch point or responsibility as far as FSMA 204 goes. So at the top, we're identifying all the parties that could be involved in this specific example, right? Those are the peach bubbles. Then we're talking about, all of the different locations that the tomato could go to. So those are the little icons that you're seeing across the journey. And then we highlighted in gray, you're seeing the CTEs that are covered by FSMA 204. So they're in gray at the bottom. Now, we talked about this a lot in our work group. We said, there's additional steps that could happen. Internally, you're going to have to store certain information that we're not calling out here very specifically. So, for example, if you look at step 6, if the tomatoes are repacked by a processor, a new traceability log code needs to be assigned, right? But then once that's assigned, the distribution center knew what log codes the repacker knows what log codes they received. They transform it, but then they're just going to send out the new log code, correct? And then it must be passed down to the other supply chain partners down the chain. So we are illustrating all of this. There's in the guideline, there's a lot of description that happens for this process that you can access. It's already in the GS1 US website if you go to the food safety page. So another interesting example is a peanut butter cracker. And we were talking a lot about why do peanut butter cookies, right, Julie, don't apply? And well, because it has a kill step. Peanut butter cookies go into the oven with the peanut butter, but the crackers don't. So we divided it into when is it that the peanut paste, right, goes into the specific manufacturing plant, the multi-ingredient manufacturer, and then after that it becomes a cracker. And how does it go downstream as well? And then notice here we also have steps 8 and 9, which is transformation and initial packing. There's a new log code that is assigned when it becomes that actual cracker, right? And a lot of steps need to happen in that manufacturing plant, but that definitely, they're captured inside there, but then the shipping event is what is shared downstream. And now with that, I pass it on to John for the questions.
Thank you very much. So what we wanted to do here is we really distilled down, some of the questions and a lot of the topics that we're hearing, from different organizations as they go through this process. So this is a combination of items around data and where the data needs to be stored and methods of managing the data and methods of sharing the data. But, if we take a look at the data sharing, so the rule says that you must store the data for 24 months. And, like all of these, mandates and regulations that are coming down, the final rule does not really prescribe what the method of storing that information is. So you could become compliant by storing the records as, paper or electronic copies and photocopies and pictures and things of that nature. Store it in, a filing cabinet in your office, and you would technically be compliant. Now, the challenge with that one is that takes up a lot of space. So if we think about what we've already heard today, there's going to be a lot of data that needs to be captured in this process in order to be able to move product through and be able to trace it back, using through the critical tracking events and through the critical data that you need to capture. So if you make the choice to do all of that via paper, that's a lot of paper to store. It's a lot of paper to manage. And when you do have a requirement, remember the requirement from the FDA says that you must report that within 24 hours. So going through this process manually and trying to dig things up and understand where everything is will definitely be challenging. And I have seen companies go through, mock recalls where they need to go through and understand where these items are. And if you don't have these items stored electronically, it's a very large undertaking. So of course, with all the information that we're talking about, what we really want to do is think about how we can tie all this information together and store it in an electronic manner. Now, one of the challenges, that that we run into in talking with people is a lot of this information is stored across multiple systems, right? So you may have a manufacturing system or an MES system or an ERP system or any number of different systems that you have this information in. So the first thing you really should start to think about is taking an inventory of the data that you're going to need to capture and share, and understand in what systems do you have it, and equally importantly, where don't you have that information. And also the thing to keep in mind is we're storing information at a new level of granularity, and there's a lot more information. So in traditional systems may not have a place to store that. So you need to think about ultimately, how am I going to capture that information? How am I going to store that information? And how am I going to work that into my day-to-day process so it doesn't negatively impact how my systems work and how my processes work? So the thought process of utilizing barcoding and RFID and other technologies in order to speed the capture of this information and the accuracy of this information to get it into your system is going to be key. And then the other thing that I like to think about is why do all of this work in getting all of this additional information just to be compliant? So what we want to really be able to do is to look at our processes, look at how we're capturing information, and utilize that capture of information to actually drive processes within your back-end business systems. So as an example, if I am processing product through a manufacturing line or a production line, and then having that manually entered back into my ERP system or my production system at a later point in time, this new rule that's coming down that you will have to comply with may give you the opportunity to look at that process and see how I can streamline it and capture the information that's required in order to fulfill FSMA 204 and be able to gather some business benefit from that as well. The other thing is, and to think about, and this goes back to the earlier discussion, am I required to use standards? Well, you're not. You can, use any method, again, that allows you to produce this information and share this information. But in order to be able to effectively share this information, the adherence to standards and bring those standards into the way that you share this information is going to be key to adoption. And one thing to think about as you look at your broader supply chain is you're going to have a varied number of partners that you deal with, and they're going to utilize various technologies to receive this information or share this information. So that's why the standardization, both on how we share information as well as how we name information, becomes so key. Because a small grower, as an example, who is shipping product to a large multinational, food producer, is going to have a much different level of technology available to them. But if we start to sit back and think about what standards am I going to use to share that information, and what am I going to call, the information that I'm sharing as it relates to those standards, you're going to be able to do that, have that adoption be much, much easier. So if we go to the next slide, and this one is an interesting one around the fact that the FDA put out a document around the new era of food safety, and it's really a very, very good document. It outlines a lot of principles of the different areas of food safety and how to think about it and how to manage it. But the core element, the first core element of the new era of food safety is really talking about tech-enabled traceability. And the tenets behind that is really understanding what standards you have in place already, and what frameworks you want to be able to use to manage that data, the ability to source that data in a quick way from electronic sources, and then digitally share that with other parties. And ultimately, what that will give you, if you think about the requirements for end-to-end traceability, is a faster way of providing stakeholders with that traceability information. But equally important, it allows you, once you have that tech-enabled traceability, to leverage the information that you're capturing. As was mentioned earlier, we now have a way of digitally mapping our supply chain, through the use of global identifiers. We have a way of digitally mapping the product that is flowing through that. So the ability to quickly be able to trace product through your supply chain using all of those common languages and all those common standards is really the foundation for tech-enabled traceability. Now, if we go on to the next slide, a very common question is I can get the information, but how can I share the information? EDI was mentioned earlier. EDI is a standard that has been around for years. Many companies are already familiar with utilizing EDI as a way of transmitting information, but it's not the only way. So there are, as an example, commercial traceability solution providers that you can work with that will help you in moving that data through the supply chain. If we look at where the pharmaceutical industry is, as an example, with their DSCSA traceability, the pipes and the functionality and the methods for moving information and sharing information in a standard way were laid out, very well in that standard. And we see, kind of the same approach being taken in FSMA 204 potentially, where you can leverage a traceability solutions provider. You can share the information through existing EDI connections. There are new clouds providers coming up all the time where you can attach additional stakeholders into your data sharing method. Of course, blockchain is always a good topic to talk about, and how that will ultimately help not only share information, but provide you with an immutable way of ensuring that information is correct and hasn't been tampered with. So there are a number of different vehicles, and what I would recommend is that you start to take a look now at what vehicles make sense to use within your facilities and within your IT infrastructure, and start to build that process now. And the other thing, as we mentioned earlier, is starting to build out that inventory of information. So taking a look at the critical data events that you need to capture, and do I have all them readily available to be able to share via whatever vehicle I decide it's time to use. So if we take a look at, kind of the key takeaways, from a data perspective and from a systems perspective, understanding what your supply chain looks like, who are all the providers, who are you shipping to, how are we going to share that information kind of with those partners is key. I can't recommend enough to the ability to look at your current capabilities, look at your processes, and don't look at this as just fulfilling a mandate. Really look at it as, how can I streamline information throughout my enterprise in order to drive better visibility for my business benefit, and then as a side benefit of that, you get FSMA 204 compliance. If you look at it the other way around, what tends to happen is, these solutions become very siloed, and they're built specifically from a compliance perspective, and they're not really truly integrated in the day-to-day operations of your organization. And the other thing, you need to start to communicate now with your suppliers, with your customers, so that you can start to collaborate on what the overall solution is going to look like. Everybody's in the same boat. Everybody needs to comply, with the regulation, so we can drive this, to a better business outcome, and become compliant as a part of it. And the biggest thing, and we saw this in the DSCSA, is don't wait. You don't want to be in line with hundreds of other suppliers and hundreds of other manufacturers as the date for compliance comes in, trying to get a system in place, because it won't be the best system that you can possibly put in. So that is, from a data perspective, the way that we're thinking about it, and happy to take any questions or comments.
Right, and I have come off mute and turned my camera back on as well. So I know for the group, you know, when we get into those questions, which thank you, John, you did an excellent job of like, you know, covering some of those big buckets. You know, I've received a question, and Lucy, I'll start with you on this one. You know, I've had folks ask, like, well, isn't there something like the GDSN that we can use for event data, right? Is there some big database in the sky where we can put everything? Do you want to speak to that?
Yes, absolutely, Julie. Well, even GDSN is not a database in the sky, but
Right.
we do have Data Hub where we can have product information, location information, um, and party information. But actually, even with transactional data, no, there's not a vehicle that is for everybody to look at and see and share. Which is why I guess blockchain was a big buzz, right? Like, oh, where are we going to store this data? So every company will have to maintain that in the vehicle that they choose, which could be a cloud solution, it could be your backend systems, blockchain, etc. But talking a little bit about that GDSN and that master data piece, there are standards to define the attributes. So if you're doing things in your own system, right? For example, for master data, you can make that part of your traceability plan. You can share it using GDSN, and you can define it the same way for all your network. Same thing with the global data model. There's also the global location data model as well, which defines party and location information. So even though there's not a system like GDSN for transactional data, there's a lot we can do to predefine those attributes. So then, as regardless the technology or system you're using, you can talk seamlessly to your trading partners.
Yeah, and I think the challenge that everyone needs to think about, you know, kind of as they look at those identifiers and how they're going to store them, is making sure today that in their ERP system, in their order to cash system, or, you know, kind of in the system that's going to house this information, they have the appropriate spot to put that. Because a lot of times, especially in older systems, because,
Yes.
you know, in days gone by, this wasn't something that was thought about in the database design or in, you know, kind of the interaction. So, you know, that's part of that inventory process that I talked about, is learning, do I have places to even store this information that I'm going to need to support the traceability?
And I would like to add one more thing there. As we think about what data we're going to leverage, right? If we're going to talk about transactional data, do I need to enter the product information all the time with, you know, a shipping event? No, I don't, because I have master data that I can reference and bring it, call on it every time I have that other transaction data coming through.
Yep. And I see we're starting to get some questions on the chat. So I'm going to ask this first one of our panelists, and I may hop in and help answer these as well. So the first question is, what are the other reasons why supply chain participants should consider traceability digital data capture capabilities prior to the FSMA 204 compliance mandate deadline? Are there other ways of capturing a return on investment? And I'll just take a quick crack at that, and then I'll hand it over to the two of you as well. But, you know, big picture, you know, a lot of companies have tech-enabled traceability programs in place today, and they're capturing these critical tracking events, and they're getting that picture, right? They're being able to connect the dots using lot codes and other things like G10s and GLENs, et cetera. Where they're seeing a lot of value is they're using that data. And John, you said it beautifully, right? Like, don't look at this as FSMA compliance. You are getting visibility for your supply chain and for your supply chain partners. So when we're talking about things, for example, like produce, we can manage freshness, right? If we can see the lots and we can see those dates, and that's data that you're gathering on a regular basis, you can see which partners are meeting those windows, right? Who's bringing you product that you know is meeting your requirements for freshness and things like that. Mispicks, looking at things like you know, here at you know, at FoodLogiQ, we have something called the unknown G10 report, right? So when people are gathering and they're scanning at point of delivery, we're getting that data, and it's like, hey, you know, this item walked into your store and we don't know what it is, right? And so it facilitates some of that visibility that you might not have today. The other piece is ensuring, right, like marrying it with other trusted sources. Like I've got this critical tracking event from my distributor. Maybe I'm an operator and I'm marrying that with my invoice information, the order information, et cetera. So if I ordered 10 and I got 12, why did I get the 12, right? What are some of the business reasons and things like that? And John, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to speak to some of those other benefits?
Yeah, and I just want to add on to, kind of some of the things that, especially that you were talking about towards the end of your points, and they were all fantastic. But, when you look at the data or critical tracking events, and that's not the only thing that you can attach to these identifiers, right? So you can look at additional pieces of business data, manufacturing data, distribution data, anything, because once I've started to segment my manufacturing or distribution process, because I have to from an identification perspective, now I can attach additional pieces of context data to that element and trace things that I've never had the ability to trace before. And then also, when you start to think about, downstream traceability with all of this additional context and rich data set that you never had before, the ability to leverage that from an ROI perspective is pretty significant. So Julie, it's really, just kind of adding on to your thought process around additional data elements that you can put onto this information.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that really gets heightened when we get into, I'm going to go back to one of our slides here. You've got the whole chain, and the way that FSMA 204, the requirements are written today is you're responsible for the roles that you own. Well, for most grocers, for example, they are the end of the chain, right? They are the retail food establishment, but they are also the distributor. And sometimes they own commissaries or food processing facilities, and they're also doing some sort of production, right? Doing a transformation event. And so, they're not only responsible for collecting data for all three of those roles, but they're also going to be receiving critical tracking event information for that shipment, for the shipment of those items that are coming to their facilities. And so that again, right, I'm getting more data that I can analyze, that I can utilize across my business. So real quick, we've got another question in here, and it's a great one, asking about, hey, I've got, what is the timeline in months for companies to be ready from the different needs, but mainly system readiness, and what would that cost look like? I don't know if we can talk about cost here, but certainly this idea of multiple warehouse management, ERP, different versions, capabilities, and even in-house developed systems, right, that are probably obsolete. And that is part of the challenge. And John, you spoke to this. You could have all of the CTEs, but it's in 10 systems. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, so, and I think it's a great question because everybody's in that boat, right? And, the other thing that's happening, as I like to say, the IT department's not waiting around looking for things to do, right? So, the question really becomes is how do I implement the ability to capture and store the information that I need? And every company is going to be a little bit different, right? Depending on their complexity and depending on what they have in place. And, honestly, your existing WMS and ERP may not be the right place to store all of this information, right? But it may be the right place to store pointers that point to a system that holds all of the information, right? Because you may have such a vast, variety of systems that you need to deal with that, you can't even get it done by the launch date of the system. But can you put in a solution as an overlay to your existing systems, have those systems communicate, and then, go in that direction? Some companies, they're going to have the capability because they have one order to cash system and, it's fairly modern and they can plug some things in and they're off and running, and others are not. And then, the other thing I just caution the audience about is the impact of divestitures and acquisitions of companies, and then what those companies that you may bring into your organization bring with them or don't bring with them, right? So you have to think about that as well. As it relates to an overlay that can be kind of the compliance and context information to a execution system, which can participate in that. So that's kind of my thoughts around that.
Yeah. And another point I'd like to just add on top of that is Compliance is January 2026. You need to think about where your company's going to be in January 2026, right? So you can analyze what you have today, but you also need to be thinking future. If you're planning on building DCs, say you're an operator and you're going to open up some company-owned DCs, that needs to be part of your plan, right? How are you going to collect that data? What systems will you have? Because you might have some newer systems, like you said, that can do a lot of this work. But you need to marry that with maybe some legacy systems that your organization has to run your business and things like that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that, the thought process, I think, from an operational perspective, is this data collection needs to be part of the process. It can't be an additive task. It can't be something that you think about later. It needs to be, the act of moving the product feeds the systems. It can't be the other way around. When I've moved it, now I'm going to go back and figure out what I just moved. So it's just a, kind of a thought that I like to put out there as it relates to the operational side of the house.
And I wanted to add to that, John, because it's very easy to say, well, this app's work, right? It's just, it takes a lot of investment and it's going to take more time. But the harder piece, and where also we should be focusing on, is there is more efficient, there's a more efficient, effective process if you actually invest in this initially. Yes, at the beginning, it's a learning curve and it's an investment, but also look into the potential benefits, as Julie outlined, the inventory management, the supply chain visibility that you can have for inventory, for, all kinds of planning and better management of your supply chain. That is something that can be tangibly analyzed. It's not always what people look into when they're looking into an investment, but it is there.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, Michael, I think we're right on time. So I'll go to your last slide, these last slides here for the deck. All right. Here we go.
Great. Well, thank you, Julie. Thank you, John, and thank you, Lucy, for your time and insights today. Greatly appreciated. The slide up there is the Contact Us slide. So please, if there's any additional questions or comments that you may have, reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to answer those for you. And I'd also like to thank our audience for their active participation today. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.